Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Targol Mesbah, and on behalf of the Anthropology and Social Change Department, I would like to welcome all of you to our annual David Graeber Memorial Lecture. And we are extremely happy and honored to be hosting Eyal Weizman today. And before I introduce Eyal, who needs no introductions, I'm sure, I would just like to acknowledge the collective, collaborative nature of this event. There are multiple institutions that make this possible. So in addition to us, the Institute for the Humanities at Fraser University, Rojava University, the Institute for Social Sciences and Humanities at BUAP in Puebla, Mexico, the Élisabeth-Bruyère School of Social Innovation at St. Paul University, Canada, and the Department of Anthropology, London School of Economics and Political Science. As I said, Eyal Weizman needs little introduction, but I will stand on ceremony and introduce him properly. Eyal is the founder and director of forensic architecture and professor of spatial and visual cultures at Goldsmiths, University of London, where in 2005, he founded the Center for Research Architecture. In 2007, with Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Tetti, he established the architectural collective Dar in Beit Sahur, Palestine. He's the author of numerous books, including Hollow Land, The Least of All Possible Evils, Investigative Aesthetics, The Roundabout Revolutions, The Conflict Shoreline, Forensis, and Forensic Architecture, Violence at the Threshold of Detectability. Eyal has held positions in universities worldwide, including Princeton, Federal Institute of Technology, Zurich, and the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. He's a member of the Technology Advisory Board of the International Criminal Court and is on the board of directors of the Center of Investigative Journalism. In 2019, he was elected Life Fellow of the British Academy. In 2020, he received an MBE for services to architecture. He was the recipient of the London Design Award and the Mark Cousins Theory Award. Forensic Architecture is the recipient of a Peabody Award for Interactive Media, the European Cultural Foundation Award for Culture, and the Reba Charles Jenks Award. And today's lecture is called Conditions of Life Calculated on the Gaza Genocide. And I mid-introduction remembered to slow down because of the brilliant work of our interpreters. So I just would like to remind us all that this is a live interpretation. So thank you so much, Eyal. We are so honored to welcome you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Targol, for this introduction. Thank you for Andre also for the invitation and preparation conversation. I'm really happy to lecture to all of you, friends of David Graeber and his thought, and just extend greetings to colleagues from the LSC around the corner, Center for Anarchist Anthropology in California, Institute of Integral Studies, friends in Puebla University in Mexico, in St. Paul University in Ottawa, Simon Fraser University, and also very special greetings to friends in the University of Rojava, who I hope are listening to this in the David Graeber Hall. I'm proud to give this talk at the footsteps of my friends, Alpa, Michael Hart, and David Wengro. And just to say, it is today, I believe, that David Graeber's 64th birthday would have been. So happy birthday, David. It's obviously said to give a memorial lecture rather than be in conversation with somebody you respect so much. From 2008 to 2013, I was David's colleague at Goldsmiths. Our path did cross, but I only ever started really to work with David Graeber in 2022, 2 years ago, and 2 years after he had passed. And our collaboration was facilitated and involved my friend David Wengro, and it had to do with ancient cities. What would an academic undertaking architectural forensics of state crime and colonialism has to do with the work of an anthropologist? I think the key might be in the fact that what we do in forensic architecture, and I think you may know us to be a collective of architects, journalists, lawyers, um, filmmakers, very creative, robust group that it was now branches all over the world, is that we do something that we call counterforensics. Our investigations are directed against the state agencies that usually monopolize both the crime and the investigation, both the act of colonization and the negation of that colonization. Against the nature of state crime and colonialism, our investigations are rather open, collective, and participatory. The dawn of everything intersects with the work that FA does in three intertwined ways. And of course, it's the through the dawn of everything that the collaboration with the David took place. The dawn and our work mobilized architectural traces. It looks at evidence for buildings and cities and roads, at least part of it. It has to do with countering received narratives. And finally, these narratives that the Dawn has introduced and are counter to state narratives. As the Davids destroyed the narrative that placed the modern state with its technologies and bureaucracies of hierarchies and control as the telos of social and political revolution. The dawn of everything is therefore, in our terms, probably the most ambitious counterforensic project ever undertaken. Again, counterforensic is not only about critiquing the state evidence, but about opening up possibilities for other narratives to emerge when you have destroyed state narrative about, from our perspective, about their crimes. We've undertaken together a project of digital archaeology in the dawn. The Davids proposed investigating that proposition that was proposed in the dawn, that there's a revolutionary way, or a revolution in our way of understanding cities, and opening up the possibility for the existence, in brief, of non-hierarchical cities. The project that we call the Nebelivka Hypothesis, we were looking together into a 7,000-year-old Tripilian city next to the village of Nebelivska in nowadays Ukraine, that was originally investigated by John Chapman Bizerka and Marco Nebbia. And that project was undertaken in forensic architecture with a large team under the leadership of David Piscatelli. The city first appeared not as an excavation site, but really through weak traces that needed to be interrogated by being deeply attuned to the environment. Particularly what you see here in this image in green is the sprouting of grass in the shape of an archaeological city. So we're not talking about an archaeology that digs and excavate and unearths and remove the earth from the artifact that is being fetishized, but we're looking at the environment and the way in which plants in that way responds to buried archaeology. Flowers of sprouting over buried homes only a few days earlier than they sprout elsewhere. And snow, as you would see in this image, melts slightly slower. So what you see in white here is an aerial image of the snow over that archaeological site. And the spots that you see, those white spots that you see in that image, are actually the archaeological footprint of a lost city. Technologies of detection, so the transformation of archaeology from figure to ground, from looking at the artifact into looking at the soil and the environment, enabled the discovery that in turn enabled, in that great book of the Davids, a new cultural and political interpretation. The city of Nebelivka was actually centerless. It was organized, as you would see soon, as concentric rings of domestic buildings around a mysterious open space. It had no temples and no fancy burials, no palaces and central administration, no any other sign of social inequality. Archaeologists suggested that it was governed by neighborhood assemblies, making an egalitarian society on an urban scale. And here are the kind of our study that is very tuned to signals in the earth that finally are interpreted as through various types of detection undertaken by the archaeologists that make that incredibly mysterious shape of a huge city, several thousand homes, organized around an empty center in which all homes are more or less of the same size. If these ancient Ukrainian cities are indeed to be considered cities, as the Davids claim, then our very concept of the city as one rooted in a history of extraction, predation, and hierarchy might also have to change. Now that is what I call counterforensics, really being tuned to minutiae and allowing the interpretation and opening up of new readings that I'm extremely grateful for that observation. And in the office, we've been cultivating effectively digital soil. We would slowly go through this sunflower field, which grows over the ruins of that city in central Ukraine. And you would see that the soil itself, rather than holding the artifact, the soil itself, surprisingly, is the signal of archaeology. It has also been, so now what you see is a kind of almost like a CT scan going slowly into the earth. We're cutting through the root of trees and we're looking at the interaction of all organisms that actually compose what a soil is. And the argument that here is that archaeology actually needs to go into the soil itself. It's rather than unearthing, it needs to be about earthing. It needs to be a much more earthy process that is tuned to those processes. There's even an hypothesis, and this is why the piece is called the Nebelivka Hypothesis, that the Chernozem, that you know, the famous black earth of Ukraine, is actually anthrosol, meaning a human-produced soil. That very fertile soil for which all the, the sort of the tragic history of that area that not started, but that waves of colonization that try to actually get into this miraculously fertile soil of Ukraine, what they're actually cultivating in it is an archaeological artifact because it has been produced, according to that speculation, through the interaction of human life, those cities that were built on it, accelerated the production and cultivation of that soil. So here you see how the footprint of that settlement is actually almost melting into the materiality of the soil and the footprint of Chernozem within that. We were looking also at multiple playful means in which different conditions of life could be held within that. And we're running multiple simulations about the multiple past and multiple forms of use that city has actually been, could have been, or the kind of life that could have been held by it, and a relation between built form, environment, and human culture. In the kind of work that forensic architecture does, it was almost like a playful interlude. The show opened, the project was presented in the Venice Architectural Biennale, and it opened a year after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, and a year before a horror, the scale of which we were not aware is going to come and is behind the corner for us. But it was. And this is really where I want to start the presentation today about conditions of life calculated. But before I tell you about the horrors of the genocide inflicted by Israel on Gaza and the long story of Israeli settler colonialism and Zionist settler colonialism in this part, I want to start with an image that is perhaps more hopeful. After January 19th, when the ceasefire started to be implemented, we have seen in Palestine an image that was as miraculous as it was incomprehensible. Palestinians returning to areas from which they were expelled. What you see here is people walking away from the camera, northwards, crossing a small stream that we will talk about later on in the lecture. This is Wadi Gaza. We'll return to it. Children, the elderly, a child carrying a child, walking northwards to areas from which they were displaced. In the history of Israeli settler colonialism, there are no images like that of mass return of Palestinians to area where they were displaced from. Displacement went only in one side. But of course, what they have returned to is something more like that. All conditions of life, hospitals, homes, conditions of cultural life, mosques, community centers, schools, universities, all infrastructure were non-existent. The title of this talk, Conditions of Life Calculated, comes out of Article 2C of the 1948 Genocide Convention, which forbids, under the category of special intent is, of course, the intent to destroy a group in all or in part, there, quote, the infliction of conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of a group. This framing is derived, it's not a quote, from Raphael Lemkin 1944 book on the topic. Lemkin intended to criminalize not only direct form of killing, in which there is no separation between the action and the act of killing and destruction of a group, but a form of killing that is undertaken through the destruction of the essential foundations of life, which are, in Lemkin's term, the disintegration of the political and social institutions of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of national groups. Indeed, only a reduced definition of genocide made it through the objections of the victorious American and Soviets after the World War II. But it did come through. And through it, a lot mining that category allow us actually a deep look at the history of settler colonial genocides. The combination of words conditions of life calculated are familiar to architects. They're almost synonymous with modern architecture, many of whose protagonists saw the environment conceived based on calculations that seek to maximize conditions of life, such as health, hygiene, air circulation, reproductivity, social relation, and even felicity. So in that conception of genocide reads architectural modernism in inverse. The environment maintains life. Humans are like muscles without a shell in the kind of modernist conception. The shell around the muscle is everything that humans build as necessity, as prosthesis to maintain biological and cultural life. The shell is what is destroyed, and slowly that the destruction of the environment transmit the violence onwards, and that is the act of killing. The indirect nature of killing make genocide expensive in both space and time, and allow us actually to see genocide differently than the imaginary of genocide, which is usually pegged to into the history of the Holocaust, for example, in which we have a time-intensive event of direct killing. Killing can operate along long duration and occurs in large expanses. And what is being killed is not only biological life, but cultural, the interaction and the multiplicities of forms of life that could exist in the interaction between humans and their environments. Action on architecture are able to lead over time to social and biological destruction. This lecture includes material drawn from the report that Forensic Architecture made on the Gaza Genocide at a request of the South Africa team for presentation at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. It's a project that is led by three of our researchers, Omar Fawati, Noor Abu Zaid, and again, Davide Piscatelli. Cities contain structure and infrastructure that support life. Cities are conceived sometimes too narrowly as technologies that keep societies alive. Forms of genocide that target indigenous people through settler colonial processes, while including, of course, period of intense mass murder, are often also typified by indirect, protracted type of violence, one that extended over long periods of time, that is gradual and often still ongoing. And that these forms of slow violence are often not seen as genocides. What we see in Gaza as a kind of intensification of a process of settler colonial genocide that is actually extending throughout the duration of, you would say, Israeli or Zionist settler colonial project, and definitely almost 80 years since the Nakba. The destruction of cultivated and grazing area would kill people over time. Across the colonial world, extermination zones and displacement areas from which people are removed into limited and circumscribed concentration area into which they are directed. Across the colonial world, such concentration areas have often been referred to with kind of humanitarian language, as protectorate, as protection areas, as safe zones, as humanitarian zones, as reservations, another euphemism of protection that in fact end up as death traps. Where they are is who they are, writes Patrick Wolf on indigenous people facing settler colonial violence. On October 9th, 2023, Israeli Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant said that Israel was fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly. On October 10th, he added that Gaza won't return to what it was before. We will eliminate everything. On the 13th of October, 2023, the Israeli president, Yitzhak Herzog, stated, quote, "This is an entire nation out there that is responsible. This rhetoric about civilians not being aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true. When you say not uninvolved, meaning everybody could be killed. They were using biblical codes such as reference to Amalek, an ancient people that inhabited the area between southern Palestine and northern Egypt of today. Now, on the same day, on the 13th of October 2023, a short lull followed the week-long bombing campaign, the intensity of which surpassed most in the 20th century. Okay, but there is a stop to that bombing, and there is a bombing of a different kind. What is being dropped are tens of thousands of letter-size paper. You see them here. That were moving through the air and softly falling on Gaza. Bizarre images, millions of A4 papers dropping on what has already been destroyed. In them were all sorts of printouts, words and images, words and maps. This one that was dropped on October 13 read, "Urgent statement to the residents of Gaza City. Terrorist organizations have started a war against the state of Israel. Gaza City is now a battlefield. You must evacuate your homes immediately and head to an area south of Wadi Gaza." It gave residents 24 hours to comply. Warnings are words and maps. Warnings are also speech acts. It is a contradiction. Is it a contradiction that on the very same day that the state of Israel says to Palestinians, "We are going to kill you all," they address them with a statement that is framed under your safety or for your safety? In fact, Israel made this point on its 12th of January defense at the ICJ. Quote, "To date, the IDF, this is how they call the army, has dropped millions of leaflets over every expected attack with instruction to evacuate and how to do so," etc., etc., etc. But upon being warned, people have to make a choice. They can either leave their place for a terrifying journey outdoors or stay and risk being killed. So effectively, those that were not evacuated were remaining in areas that the Israeli military were calling extermination zones, that were denied of basic and then of sufficient aid to enter places where people have been shot. The order is in most of those exterminations on issue to kill. Those that evacuated have effectively produced that image. This is the movement of Palestinians southwards. But bereaved refused to leave family members without proper burials. A day was not long enough to evacuate a modern city of more than 1 million people. There were not enough cars and trucks for everybody. There was not enough fuel in the cars that were available. Hundreds of thousands made their way on foot, holding on to their children, sacks, bags, blankets, ID card. The infirm were pushed in wheelchair along dust roads. Israeli officials promised Nakba 2.0 and have actually produced intentionally those images that would terrify Palestinians, as terror images that were intentionally produced to look and to bring the Nakba, that is the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948, in mind. Those who were evacuated along routes that Israel was claiming were safe routes were targeted. And in one occasion, we actually documented the killing of 70 people in one strike along this route. So I'm interested in looking at this image, at this map, and all I'm seeing in this map is the borders imposed on They're not international borders. These are ceasefire lines around the Gaza Strip. We see Wadi Gaza. This is this curly line here in the middle. And we see the two arrows from where Palestinians have to evacuate. That the residents of Gaza were ordered to cross a natural element, not a major road, not a town, not a village, or a neighborhood. Not anything that was human-made was ominous. The leaflet dropped that morning just showed those a natural element. Wadi Gaza is a seasonal stream running through the southern agricultural fringes of Gaza City. But amongst the chaos and confusion, people frantically called each other to ask, where do they want us to go? Urban dwellers are only ever vaguely aware of the natural features at the edges of their cities. So think about not the river that is in the middle of your town, if you wherever you live or the city, but a stream, a dry riverbed that is at the edge of it. And think if you would know how to comply to an instruction to evacuate. Friends told me they knew the Wadi. At previous time when driving past this, they rolled a window to keep out the smell of sewage. But the Wadi was not a geographical reference in their life, and panic amplified doubt. Effectively, following that, the occupation has changed the strip topography beyond recognition. It was a kind of destruction that we have not seen before. It wasn't only about destroying buildings, some building here or there. It was about ungrounding. The way of destruction is actually affected the depth of the soil. People, places, and landmarks are being obliterated, wrote Palestinian poet Omar Moussa. The occupation has changed its strip topography beyond recognition. If we survive that war, he asked, what would be our meeting point? And that kind of moonscape was created completely. And also, a friend of mine, Palestinian architect Dima Sruji, described the bulldozer's plow as the surface reading of a genocide, etched into the earth like the traces of a kitchen towel wiping dirt out of a dusty table. Families were crushed under the rubble of home. Desperate, impossible rescue attempt ensued. People shouted into the rubble in the hope their loved ones, somebody had survived and could hear the calls. Everywhere were the piercing cries of the bereaved. So the kind of architecture of genocide is one that returned that area into the kind of natural environment. Every trace that is on the surface, all conditions of life that usually occupy what in architecture we call the deep surface of the earth, have been uprooted. All the infrastructures that is under it, to bring a kind of unspoiled natural landscape back. Let's see some of those. I'll just go very fast and you would see how this is a project that was run by Shuri Demolovi and Samane Moafi from FA, with like tracking that kind of terramorphing of the environment and seeing how the creation of artificial topography, how being tuned to the surface itself. The surface includes both everything that is technical under it, but also everything that grows in it, and the depth of the soil, as we've seen with the Nebelivka hypothesis before, that are the conditions of life for anything to grow in the future. Also under the soil, the archaeological remnants. Gaza is almost like a huge linear strip of archaeology that in this kind of like along this sort of ancient coastline of Palestine. This is an archaeological site that is no longer exists. We've reconstructed it from photographs that we found with the archaeologist as a kind of digital memorial of something that is no longer there. what exists under this site is basically the deep crater of earth-penetrating bombs and the kind of terramorphing of the terrain. When hundreds of thousands of people evacuated southwards, Israel raised this artificial hill that separated the north from the south. Here, with Noor and mainly Noor, Joshua, and Andra at Forensic Architecture, we're collecting each one of the evacuation orders. Every time you'd see those grids, each one of that is an evacuation order, to look at the general pattern of movement. People were pushed south of Wadi Gaza into the border with Egypt in Rafah. And at the time that a leaked paper from the Ministry of Intelligence was saying that effectively the aim was the evacuation of the Palestinian population from Gaza to Sinai. It was only Egypt holding that line, holding that border, and not allowing Israel to displace Palestinians that stopped it. And particularly, I think that it is important to see how crazy, ludicrous as they are, plans floated now by the US administration and the president in line with the Israeli government seeks to complete the displacement of Palestinians by reconstruction as an extension of the destruction. And in fact, Israeli plans to displace Gaza refugees and Gaza inhabitants south of the border and into Egypt are the constant of the occupation. They've taken place almost in every decade by effectively destroying the Gaza economy, something that Sarah Roy called de-development, a kind of a calculated way, again, this combination, calculated way of destroying, of creating conditions of life that will not be able to support the people in Gaza so that they move down to Egypt. But something remain in my mind and in our mind in forensic architecture to do with Wadi Gaza, that obsession, that Wadi that is a place that perhaps those that are not farmers that inhabit that area are almost not aware of, that just returned as the knife of the guillotine of the genocide, a Wadi Gaza, again and again and again, displaced beyond it. And actually, it's a kind of a return of a certain colonial repressed. Zionist predecessors, the European travelers that toured Palestine in the 19th century, considered Wadi Gaza to be the southern border of Palestine. Beyond it, the desert country began. So Wadi Gaza is understood in the European imagination, looking at Palestine from the outside. First the Christians and then the Jewish Zionists, as the border, as the desert gateway, as the beginning of the desert. European travelers that made their way from Egypt to Palestine along the coastal route recorded all a similar impression, or at the sudden transformation of the environment. Quote, this is from Konstantin von Tischendorf. Like the joyousness of life could join to the shadow of death, the fields of Gaza, with their cheerful fertility, were linked to the edge of the desert. It seems a magical delusion, and how a colorful picture start emerging from a colorless canvas. So this border was understood in almost theological ways, a kind of revival. Crossing Wadi Gaza is crossing northward into Wadi Gaza is crossing into fertility, a theological imagination that was blinded, of course, to the way that people inhabited that area through the generations. So that map the Palestine exploration map ends in Wadi Gaza. There's nothing but Arab el-Tarabin. These are the Tarabin tribes that were trading along the coast, the coastal route that the Romans later called the Via Maris, that connects Port Said and Alexandria with through the Palestine coastline all the way to Damascus. These are the Tarabins that were kind of the travelers and the facilitators of that travel. That is their land. Palestine ends with Wadi Gaza. All the Europeans crossing north of Wadi Gaza are starting to be reminded all of the sudden. Edward Hull of southern Italy, Napoleon in 1979, of Languedoc in southern France. This was also the reason that when Palestine was occupied for the first time by European forces, not the first time, but in the 20th century, by European forces in October 1917, that the battles happened along Wadi Gaza. The Ottomans, who defended Palestine, fortified along the Wadi because their calculation was that the British expeditionary forces coming with the mules and horses should be left in the dry part of the landscape. And we could see in aerial images exactly along Wadi Gaza. This is a photograph from that period by the Bavarian Air Force of the fortification along Wadi Gaza. Wadi Gaza has the biggest basin in Palestine, biggest draining basin. And along that basin are organized, and this is a map of Palestinian Bedouin settlements, are organized along the different branches and routes and tributaries of Wadi Gaza. Each tributary, the kind of the social logic and the water logic somehow matches. And it is in 1948, during the Nakba, that the last expulsions that happened during that war happened downstream. Israel was pushing the Bedouin Palestinians into the Gaza Stream downstream, and Gaza emerged as a synthetic artificial geography, as a concentration area for those refugees. Not only Palestinian Bedouins, but many. There were also Palestinians from Haifa and Jaffa and a bit north of the coast that were entering. But many of the refugees in Gaza are Bedouin Palestinians. That red dot that you would see here on the southernmost tributary of Wadi Gaza is a village called Al-Ma'in, or Ma'in Abu Sita, that we're going to speak about later. It is on the basin of Wadi Gaza that Israel instituted its most robust agricultural colonization of the area. Being at the threshold of the desert, that the combination of the Wadi Gaza basin, the water just, remember, south of Wadi Gaza is where the Europeans imagined the desert began, and also the Zionists. So the Wadi Gaza basin is that area that is today the breadbasket of Israel. It used to be the breadbasket of Palestine, and this area was cultivated by Bedouins throughout the generations. Everything that you see here in white are Jewish settlements, the kibbutz and moshav that are actually built to enclose the Gaza Strip with a line of settlements, and the agricultural fields that are constructed on the ruins of Wadi Gaza. This is part of an older project that we've done in support of Palestinian Bedouin land right, where we are reading traces of settlements, agricultural settlements, buried within what has become a huge forest plantation and different plantation. Here's a preparation for a forest around a village called Al-Rakib. You see how the forests come to enclose on those Palestinians that are returning again and again as their homes are destroyed to the cemetery, and this is one of Wadi Gaza's tributaries. And here is the kind of acts of erasure that still leave a trace in the earth itself, for the presence of those communities that they expelled. If you look carefully, you would see amongst all those forms of plantation and orchards, you would see traces of eviction of Palestinians. Indeed, the annual rainfall north of Gaza, Wadi Gaza, is about 400 to 500 millimeter per year. And the amount of rain descends very fast going south of Wadi Gaza, simply because of the turn of the coast. The clouds are not coming anymore from over the sea, but over northern Africa. So you have that. And you can understand the map that I've shown you before of the displacement of Palestinians.
My apologies, Eyal.
No, it's not. It's an offensive in a memorial lecture to David Graeber to see swastikas on the screen, and it's offensive to all of us who come to who gather to celebrate David's life and the occasion of exchanging ideas, etc. So I don't take it personally. I think it's an offense against all of us, and quite shocking. But let's continue. What there is to do. So think about the desert as a kind of an environment connected to settler colonial genocide. And indeed, the desert was weaponized also in the Armenian genocide. Here on the right, though, so at the time that we were working on the genocide in Gaza, forensic architecture was involved in two other investigation on colonial genocides, one in Namibia, where we were, again, kind of like looking at the environmental conditions that underpin genocide, the kind of the relation between desert environments and the so on, in a way that genocide is operated. And I was giving also testimony together with my colleague Paulo Tavares in a trial, in a genocide trial in Guatemala, the trial of Lucas Garcia, who was in the 1980s as part of the kind of the state repression, was going to the Quiche Highland and destroying about 400 indigenous Ishil Maya villages. We were tracking through that area, trying to understand this very fragile relation of the environment and architecture that existed there. The homes were pretty much consumed by the cloud forest. Only very faint traces remained, and remained as vegetational traces. And that was about a certain kind of the botanical archaeology of that genocide. If you look at satellite remote sensing studies, this is the area of the Ishil Triangle before the genocide in 1979. And of course, there were direct acts of killings and massacres. But again, here, what was destroyed was a particular fragile relation between fields and forests. Sometimes the field and the forest is an entangled kind of, exists in a liminal space. You know, fields and forests are not separated, but things are cultivated in and between trees. And sometimes we were able to find the villages by looking and tracing together with our partners from this area to look at fruit-bearing and medicinal trees that their higher density allowed us to actually locate those villages. So what was destroyed was, again, the conditions of life, the forest, as the deforestation was the act of genocide. Again, violence that is applied onto the environment, and the environment transmit that violence onto people. And again and again, you see the same thing. Those safe areas that the government has built after destroying the mountains and the forest in the mountains, in the valleys, concentration areas for the survivors where they were re-educated, controlled through all acts of humanitarian assistance, etc., that was given. And here we need to understand, both in the evacuation orders and in the way in which humanitarianism is weaponized in order to drag people into zones in which they are later slowly exterminated, as continuous with genocide rather than something that always mitigates it. This is actually quite interesting and incredible image that we have obtained in the context of the Al Ma'in case that I will speak about in a second. What you see is the southern part of what is now the Gaza Strip. This is Wadi Gaza. And these are sand dunes. This is really where Wadi Gaza is. Effectively, that area of the sand dunes, you remember the image I showed you about evacuation before, is completely coextensive with the so-called humanitarian zone that was applied onto Gaza. It is really difficult to think about that area in ecological terms because it's one of the densest places in the world, and all images that we have of the Gaza Strip and the refugee camps and cities on it is this densely built refugee camps. But we cannot understand, I think, the nature of the genocide if we're not looking at it also. We do not look at the earth, at the soil and the water, and the way that they interact in this area. Gaza is made out of two types of soil. One is the fertile alluvial soil that drained down Wadi Gaza into the sea, and the other is sand that arrives down the Nile that is piled onto the Gaza Strip. And the Via Maris, the roots, the ancient root exist really at the edge between dunes and fertile agricultural soil. And indeed, look at where the map is. This is all evacuation order have led to that dune area called Al-Mawasi, which is in fact an area inhabited by Bedouin Palestinians, sparsely, but still inhabited by Bedouin, who managed to actually quite ingeniously cultivate between the dunes by finding buried water within it. And a lot of the survival in Al-Mawasi, in this concentration area, was due to that indigenous knowledge of learning how to obtain water in these parts. This is Ma'in Abu Sitta. As you see, it is just outside of the borders imposed on the Gaza Strip. It's a village that was occupied and depopulated on the day that the State of Israel was declared on the 14th of May, 1914. It is based around this sort of star shape, and you see the area that the Abu Sitta family cultivated is entirely cultivated. All those are fields within that. Salman Abu Sitta was 9 when he was driven out of Ma'in Abu Sitta on the 14th of May. And very often in forensic architecture, even when we do very contemporary work, we are trying to also look at a long history of the present that we are seeing. Salman Abu Sitta has grown to become the foremost chronicler of the Palestinian tragedy and the Nakba, and the foremost advocate for the Palestinian right of return. He came to our office and he was asking us several questions. He knew that we have the access to archives, to historical aerial images and others, and he wanted to know how his landscape was destroyed, who looted his property, who demolished his family houses and burnt his home. He asked us who blew up the school that his father built at the center of that village in 1920. What happened to the historical stone? Why did they build a kibbutz in a particular way on their land? What first installations they made? Barracks, water tanks, fortified fences, prefab accommodation. And what we've undertaken with him, again, we've undertaken a full reconstruction, and you would see here my colleagues, Samane and Agatha, undertaking a kind of what we call situated testimony. We're building together with
the rainwater coming in.
Sorry, we're building together with witnesses the spaces as they remember them. We are doing it to current crimes. We have done that for survivors of Syrian torture prisons in Sednaya. We've undertaken a similar processes with survivors of the Grenfell Tower fire, but we can do it also to historical events. And here Salman is reconstructing piece by piece elements of both the village of Ma'in Abu Sitta and its depopulation.
It created a trough passage of water. There was a gap like this here, and it followed the Wadi.
Between pathway.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's good. So there's just a hole here. Because it's not uniform. I think nobody knows that except me.
Yeah, well, and now everybody would know that. So we use model as mnemonic devices to really kind of also allow moments of recollection that are otherwise difficult to explain with words, but through immersing a witness in the space, we can actually interrogate that. And this is also an analysis. So here we are looking at a British. During the Second World War, the British Air Force took the last photographs of Palestine before the Nakba. This is in January 1945. This is the image. This is the center of Al Ma'in with the 7 routes. And later we were using Israeli aerial images to see how the different elements of Al Ma'in from 1945 were replaced by the kibbutzim, in this particular case, Kibbutz Nirim, that was built directly on their land, erasing and transforming that Palestinian life in this area. Initially, the border to the Gaza Strip was not fenced. It was simply a plow that ran and cut a ditch in the middle of what you see here is Palestinian farm. A ditch was cut and separated 2 conditions of life, calculated to do different things. On the right side, on the Israeli occupied side, it was where the beginning of the Green Revolution was synthetic fertilizers and somehow also a reshuffling of Palestine's geology. They were taking minerals from the Dead Sea, like phosphorus, and putting it on the fields of the Nakab, the Negev, in this part in order to increase the fertility of the zone. And on the other side, conditions of life that dammed the water, that did not allow the water comes obviously from the Israeli-controlled side of the ceasefire line, calculated to bring about migration away, or expulsion away from these parts. So we're doing, I'm running out of time, but we were doing a lot of reconstruction of the agricultural logic, trying to understand through the image and through situated knowledge of Salman, really the way in which Ma'in Abu Sita, this star-shaped settlement, was actually managing the land, and the kind of life and forms of political life and cultural life and agricultural life were kind of intersecting in this area. And then the settlements that are being built on this land here in green, initially you see the settler colonial violence initially is cartographic. The map is not changed. It is on the map that a line is being drawn and a new geography is being imposed. Everything is erased. This would have been the center of the star where Ma'in Abu Sita, the entire village would have been. It's not all that is mapped is the topographical line, and on it, what is being put is the Israeli agrarian settlements that start industrializing agricultural production. In this way, we've also, at the request of Salman, we've dug into the archive and realized that the architect that has actually built that is one of 3 graduates of the Bauhaus School of Architecture, the famous modernist school in Weimar and then in Dessau, that arrived in Palestine, Shmuel Misechkin. And through Misechkin work, understood the way in which the agrarian settlements at the time are not only about the architectural design of homes, but the kind of industrialization of fields calculated to amplify agricultural productivity, etc. And so you see that line, that plow line separating the Gaza Strip, what has become the Gaza Strip, from the area occupied, and the way in which the kibbutz settlements are kind of built as fortification. There is no other fortification than those settlements themselves. Everything in the front are open plowed fields that would allow shoot to kill policy. The policy was any Palestinian crossing the plow ditch, the plow line, would be shot and destroyed. And you see even the continuity here is a kind of a weird map that somebody made, in which on the right side you have the 1945 aerial image from the British. On the left side you have already the genocide, but it's the same place. And you see how from the center of where Al-Ma'in was, is now a military base from where the tanks are actually invading Gaza, continuing the routes, the 7 routes that were leading out of these settlements. And again, you see that kind of plowing over, that kind of erasure, rubbing out every trace of Palestinian life in this part. I'm going to skip a lot of the study in order to get to that image of the South African ambassador to the Netherlands, Vusi Mondosela, delivers boxes of evidence for consideration in the International Court of Justice. The case that was brought up by South Africa against Israel is historical in many ways. It is, and international courts have often been accused of focusing on Africa, in which, European courts are becoming arbitrators of crimes committed by post-colonial regimes in Africa. Here, you have a state that came out of survived settler colonialism, as Namibia was part of or colonized by the South African state, genocide, the settler colonial genocide, apartheid, and uses that platform not as to ask for singularity, but actually to kind of deal with that issue that has not been dealt with throughout 77 years. The crime of Israeli settler colonialism that is not, in the case, was always making reference to the long duration of the genocidal campaign. It was making references to the 56-year-old occupation, to the 20-year siege, etc. And this is why it's important to understand the environmental and historical context of genocide, because genocide does not emerge out of nowhere. It is not something that just erupts. It is an intent, a genocidal intent evolves over time, and the means by which the Gaza genocide is unfolded continued forms of calculations and forms of degrading of life that existed throughout the history of Israeli settler colonialism. Yeah, so I think this, in this case, it almost feels as if the Global South is using those mechanisms of international justice to call out not only Israeli settler colonial genocide, but the entire Western support for it. But I want to end with another reference to another of the Abu Sitta family. I said before that Abu Sittas are belonging to the Tarabin tribe, that same tribe that I was talking about at the beginning, and that we were talking about the school at the center of Al-Ma'in, the school that really was a testimony of Sheikh Hussein Abu Sitta belief in education. And Salman and his brothers went on studying. And I think you know another family member from the Abu Sittas, Ghassan Abu Sitta, who is the physician who was in Gaza for 43 days during the beginning of the genocide and bore testimony to what is happening there, particularly about the destruction of another conditions of life, the hospital. And again, we are in our situated testimony room, working together with Ghassan Abu Sitta on the reconstruction of the strike that happened on the 18th of October, very much at the beginning, 10 days after the beginning of the, 10 days after October 7th, the bombing of the Al-Ahli hospital, to which he is a witness. And I'd like to end with 2 short clips from his testimony so that we kind of understand also the power of medical testimony within this, in the context of this genocide.
So inside the operating room suite, there's first operating room, second operating room, and then the third operating room, which we had turned into a dorm. And then there's the recovery room where the patients come out to recover from the surgery. And then there is a room where we sat and had tea and coffee. And then you kind of step outside. There's a kind of courtyard, back courtyard here. And I had gone back to that room. I dropped them off, gone back to that room, waiting for them to bring the next patient. And then that's when the kind of the screeching noise and then the explosion. And then bits of the whole ceiling fall. And then I kind of start to look around and everybody's screaming, but I notice that there's no one injured. So I turn right and I walk out. Turn left and then out of there. And then I start filming here.
So this is where the video starts.
Yes. And I could see the courtyard, the main courtyard on fire from here.
Sorry, I'm going to skip over that because some of those images are quite hard. Yeah.
This morning, when I drove into the hospital, I noted how full the hospital courtyard was with families who had sought refuge inside the hospital, thinking that it would be a safe haven. It's these very same families who are now either dead or critically wounded as a result of this attack. This is a war crime that the world has seen coming. Israel has been warning the entire world that it was going to attack Palestinian hospitals, and it did exactly that. Every Western politician who has declared unconditional support for Israel's war effort on the Palestinian people has the blood of these children on their hands. That unconditional support is what led us to this massacre. What happened today is a war crime. And if the Israelis get away with it again, then more war crimes will be committed and more hospitals will be targeted.
This is the image of the genocide. This is the beginning of that.
When it stopped being a war and it became a genocide.
You rang the bell on that.
Yeah.
And indeed, this hospital has turned into that image of ungrounded earth. And I think that the earthliness of that genocide, the fact that when we think about it spatially, what we see are those, an area that has been completely dug up. This ungroundedness is a way to actually kind of understand a new form of violence that this genocide has brought about. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry I lost a little bit concentration towards the end. It's not very often that one delivers a talk about genocide and has to deal with Nazis on the screen. I apologize for that experience that you've all endured, and looking forward to a conversation.
Thank you so much, Eyal. I also would like to apologize for all of us, for having to endure the shameful disruptions. And thank you so much, Eyal, for your deeply thoughtful, provocative, important, timely talk. And I would like to invite folks to share your questions in the chat. Heather will help me read off the questions. There's a question from Micah. Can you extrapolate on the connection of this ecological observation here to the Nebelivka hypothesis that you started with, erasure and the at least perceived contradiction between town and country, and how different life ways are possible? A new contradiction emerges of soil and life, building versus terraforming, terro and terror forming.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think, you know, the architecture of this genocide is looking carefully at the landscaping of this entire area. The bulldozers that are pouring in, fleets of D9 bulldozers, uproot everything along their way, stab their front shovel a meter deep, taking buildings, orchards, piling them up into a landscape that is not static. The landscape is continuously being transformed. Some of those hills are there to create military encampments, some of them to create barriers, some of them to block roads, but they are constantly transforming. Think of the terraforming of the Gaza Strip as an elastic, constantly changing topography like waves in the sea. That is what we're seeing. And we are seeing it because I think there is a way in which it is in the ground, both the first meter of technological topsoil, I mean, where the roads, electricity, if there is, water, sewage is organized. But deeper into it, there are conditions of possibility for the future. What you look into the deep earth under, you're looking dozens, if not 100 years forward, because the earth is a kind of a meta-organism that produces itself. And if, as we have seen, it is being poured with, you know, when a building is destroyed, a building is solid toxic waste. When a building is destroyed, it turns back into the chemicals, and the chemicals are washed deep into the depth of the soil. In some Israeli operations, they have actually poured salt water into this. The bombs that are being thrown onto Gaza are depth bombs that explode sometimes 30 meters under. Of course, they are supposedly aimed at the tunnels, which justify every type of attack that we're seeing. But the bombs are exploding 30 meters under and create chemical events within the soil that completely transform it. So we are talking about an area that is being the destruction of conditions of life being in the soil. And that is perhaps a link, though I don't want to make the link too direct to the Nebelivka hypothesis, but this is something that we've learned, the forensic architecture team, David, Davide, and I, when we were looking at the Nebelivka hypothesis, at the Earth as something that is continuous with, rather than the place on top of which architecture is happening, right? The kind of archaeological meaning, the kind of the human-induced, the anthropogenic Earth that existed in Nebelivka is an archaeological signal in the same way that a lived-in Earth facilitate and enable multiple conditions of life. So we are seeing, this is why I'm saying we're seeing something else. We've seen in the history of settler colonial genocide, expulsion. We've seen deforestation. We've seen destruction. We've seen pushing into the desert. Here we have a destruction of the deep surface and the deep and the depth in a way that would affect conditions of life into the future. And this is where you mine the Article 2C of the Genocide Convention from something that is direct violence, an act of violence that has a perpetrator and victim, a gun is shooting, the bullet is moving from one person to the next, somebody's hit, into a form of violence is an attack on the environment, and the environment is left to do the killing.
Thank you, Eyal. Our next question from Max. I wonder how the images of a Palestinian tunnel network spread by the IDF are connected to the notion of ungrounding, another justification to dig up the landscape?
Yeah,
as a question.
exactly. So firstly, I have to say, tunnels are emerging also out of a local indigenous knowledge that is held by the Tarabeens, by others, of deep wells. That part of Palestine, the southwestern coast of Palestine, is known for thin and deep wells. The water level is very deep. The well at the center of Ma'in Abu Sitta is 95-meter deep. Imagine making a 95-meter well is as a complicated architectural feat as to build a 95-meter tower. You go into a medium of the earth that has multiple layers and is dynamic, and you need to make it hold. The farmers, the Tarabeen farmers, and all other farmers that ended up in Gaza understand the relation between surface and depth. And immediately when the occupation began, or very shortly after the occupation of 1967 began, when Israel started controlling the surface of Gaza, Palestinian resistance goes into the tunnels. Initially, it is on the border between Rafah, the Egyptian Rafah, and Palestinian, in which farmers, now separated by a wall that separated the Tarabeen that were left in Egypt and those in Gaza, were connecting through the medium of the earth, the medium earth. They connected through it. They understood how to get into the layers. What is the right layer to go in horizontally? And the tunnels became a way to open up again the Via Maris, the old trade route that connected Gaza and Egypt, because trading goods could now bypass that border. Later, the resistance groups, different ones, initially, the first documents I found are from the PFLP, the left-wing breakaway from the PLO group of the PFLP, Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Their fighters were connecting homes in a refugee camp of Shati already in 1971 with tunnels. Actually, it was the idea of a Palestinian architect, refugee, studied architecture in Egypt, came back, Mohammed al-Aswad, who was rewiring the subsoil in the refugee camps. For the Israeli military, the strip is like conceived as a horizontal human shield, right? Because everything under it is criminalized. They do not have, when they bomb into tunnels, the bomb has to cross through the city. It generates a seismic event under the city, buildings collapse into it, but they justify, and then you cannot see if there was a tunnel, yes or no. So it's become the perfect, for them, justification for all acts of ungrounding that has occurred there. So there is a way in which, tunnels exist. Tunnels are at the same time very real and a phantasmagoric element. They're operating in those two realms and have been used as a kind of justification for that form of ungrounding and for this attack on the soil itself.
Thank you. Our next question Lee asks, in Mbembe's Necropolitics, he argues Israel's ongoing genocide, he wrote this before the latest escalation, uses the state-of-art technology as well as Stone Age technology, as well as saying it is in the air and beneath the ground. Can you connect this to your wider lecture?
Yeah, Achille is actually referring to this work in Necropolitics and to the conception that was developed in the politics of verticality and later in Hololand, by which we need to think about, we cannot look at cartography. I know I showed many aerial images and maps, but the imaginary I try to conjure with you through words and maps is that of a volume, in which initially you have that division. You have Israel in total control of the airspace. You have Palestinians controlling the subsoil, and in between them, there is the deep surface of the earth, right? And one needs to understand the verticality of that has been created also and mobilized as part of the occupation in order to understand what is going on. You cannot simply understand it on a two-dimensional surface. You need to have volume in it. And I think that if I had another lecture, you know, here, chapter 2 would have really been about the subsoil and the way it was inhabited.
Thank you so much. I hope that in some capacity, in some way, we can get that second part. Josh asks, is there a connection between the transformation of the desert into a weapon of genocide in Gaza and also in the Armenian genocide and the genocide against the Nama and Herero in Namibia, as you mentioned, and the Zionist myth of, quote, making the desert bloom?
Yeah, absolutely. So two things. Firstly, there's a direct relation, no? I mean, the desert does the killing. If conditions of life calculated are is the architecture that maintain life, the environment or the building, you can do two things. You can either destroy the environment and leave people there, and the destruction of the environment does the killing, or you can remove people to another environment that does not have that conditions of life. And that is the context by which the Great Syrian Desert, the Omaheke Desert, and the Sinai Desert have features as genocidal spaces in the imaginary of the perpetrators of these genocides. And therefore, the line that separates, the nominal line, that is never in an environment, you'd never have a line between the desert and the sun. You have a slow process of gradual transformation where conditions of life gradually change. But there is in all those a kind of an understanding, the Asap River, the expulsion from the Waterberg into the Omaheke. There is a kind of a figure ground relation, a kind of a line that separates, that is being weaponized as the element that kills. The interesting thing is that a desert line is obviously not a static element. It's a dynamic one. And colonialism always saw itself as climate change. Now, we tend to think about climate change when this was still the word that was used to describe the climate catastrophe or chaos that we're experiencing right now. Climate change, as the combination of word climate and change, first occur in the colonial imagination of the 18th and 19th century as a way of transforming desert environments into arable land. So there are ideas to irrigate the desert in the US or in the Americas by creating artificial clouds, a climate change as a project rather than as the collateral of modernity. And that these processes, so making the desert bloom is a colonial imaginary that exists throughout colonial frontiers that have deserts. It was used equally in the American West as it was used by Mussolini in Libya, as it was used by French colonizers in Algeria, etc. That is always the idea of the desert is a site of neglect by the indigenous population who don't deserve it, and now we would re-engineer the environment, get water from here to here, change the soil, bring some nitrate, put it, and boom, you know. Make the desert bloom is another synonym also of the Green Revolution, right? The Green Revolution, the idea of the kind of amplification of cultivation comes with nitrate. On this part. The thing is that also what we're seeing in the Namibia project in forensic architecture, again, it's a project that is now run by Omar Fawati and Agatha Chongliang, that the genocide was undertaken by expelling the Over Herero into the desert, but then the desert came onto the Somme, because colonial practices transformed the ecological balance and the desert start rolling back and put, you know, so kind of desertification is also being amplified by the effect of colonization in fragile desert edge environments.
Our next question is more a comment, and I'll read it, and if you had thoughts that you wanted to share about it, from Darren. I don't have this thoughtfully formed here, but I'm thinking about the proposed rebuilding of Gaza by developers, Trump, replacing the lived collective human scale architecture with the architecture of neoliberal capitalism, built not to serve its inhabitants, but it's fully consumed in the corporate economies of construction. Yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No,
Eyal?
absolutely, absolutely. This is, you know, people were saying, oh, Trump is thinking outside of the box. He's thinking well within the box of the history of Israel relation to Gaza. The idea that development is continuous with destruction has also always been a part of colonial techniques. Think about the war in Algeria, no, where the French actually used both the destruction and then reconstructed villages, model villages, and towns in a way that could be controlled and in a way that would actually move people from an area that they wanted to control or cultivate into other areas. I've shown you also in Guatemala, those model villages that are being built is the use of architectural development as a form of continuation of ethnic cleansing and displacement. In one of the biggest, when Israel was building buildings for refugees in Gaza, the person most behind it was Ariel Sharon. Ariel Sharon is the general most associated with destruction in Gaza, but he was also building housing. He built housing because he thought that he tried to transform a political problem for Zionists, the identity of refugees, refuginess included in it the right of return, into an architectural one. So he thought that if he would build nice houses for refugees, they would not be refugees anymore. They would not like to struggle. They would give up the right of return. So in the 70s, Israel has already built, both in Sinai and in southern Gaza, housing that try to move Palestinians from north of the Wadi to south of the Wadi through development. So that is this is as long as colonialism, the idea of subduing insurgency by architectural means, you know, Corbusier has this kind of book ambiguously titled Architecture or Revolution, no? And that was always also a technique of dealing with urban insurgency and protest through housing. Think about Haussmann's redesign of Paris. It both involved destruction of the old medieval built fabric and the construction of bourgeois housing along avenues. So that there's a duality in it. And what we're seeing now in the proposals is a simple continuation of the genocide transferred through reconstruction, enacted through reconstruction. It's also disturbing that while the genocide, that stage, the previous stage, and I hope we're not going back to it, of the genocide was unfolding, you know, international organization was speaking about destruction of conditions of life, about unexploded munition, about the number of houses, and people saying, oh, you know, you're anti-Semitic, negating the data, not allowing people to speak. A lecture that is titled the same lecture as today that I'm supposed to give in Berlin next week has been canceled. I was scheduled to speak with Francesca Albanese in the Freie Universität Berlin. We just announced that we cannot speak. What are we doing? We're documenting the Israeli genocide in Gaza. Now it's the Trump administration that takes the same figures and say, well, you cannot live there. There are 30,000 unexploded munitions. There is 80% of housing stock is destroyed, etc., as reasons for displacement. And you see how quickly those things flip. Sorry, Freie Universität Berlin. What did I say? Something else.
Thank you, Eyal. James asks, if we understand that Zionism originated as a 19th century imperialist political project of lock-in liberal governance of Assyria in the East Africa Protectorate, designed by and for the British Empire, how does forensic architecture respond to this international dimension? For example, the RAF flying daily stories from Cyprus over Gaza to collect intelligence for the IDF bombings at the end of the US imperial neo-colonial global hegemony.
This has been a war of Germany, the US and UK and many other countries that supply Israel with the guns and the diplomatic support to perform this genocide. These are the same states that when another country undertake their scales of human rights violation, immediately run and call genocide, issue arrest warrant, etc. The South Africa case is actually so important that it is being raised because it is actually a country from the global South that is coming to call out and expose that web of complicity.
This is kind of consolidating, I believe, a few different prompts. A few folks are asking if forensic architecture, if it's working on more broadly the genocide studies, especially, for example, with the situated testimony technique, and out of personal interest, particularly in the Armenian case.
The answer is yes, in particular to the end of that question, but we cannot expand on this further now.
Hamid asks, could you please comment a little more on the analytical/methodological role of slow violence in your work?
Yeah, this is exactly what it is. Settler colonial genocide is sometimes invisible to the optics of, you know, international organizations because it just happens so slowly. I'm not saying that what happened in Gaza is happening so slowly. I'm talking about, you know, the genocidal acts, the conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of a people have been applied onto Gaza from the moment the Gaza Strip has been created. The Gaza Strip, to say Gaza Strip is to say siege. Siege is a mode of affecting conditions of life as a means of destruction, as a means of expulsion. So I think that what we see and what we saw happening in Gaza in the past 16 months, through historical analysis, allow us to understand what was happening there before. And there it is that Article 2C that is so important for me. Sorry, I'm just like 2C. Conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of a people, that is really important.
Damon asks, two visual perspectives of the self and place were seen in today's presentation. Third person, for example, maps, and first person video reconstructions of spaces from the on-the-ground view. Is there anything between these two visual perspectives? For instance, a liminal space, a void to be filled, something else?
I think, yes, I think it's a really interesting question. I think that, well, if you look at the website of Forensic Architects, our investigations, you would really see that what we have done in Gaza is kind of a departure from the normal method. It's much more cartographic. It initially, though, you know, through the situated testimony of the Abu Sittas, you have here the kind of the experiential perspective. It's historical and it is geographical on that level. I think the other agent that we wanted to bring here into the play is the environment, is the weather, it's rainfall, it's the type of soil. And if you look at our report, you would see that bringing the environment in as a kind of that surface of the earth, that liminal space, maybe that's an answer to what you're saying, into it allow you to see things that previously we couldn't see simply by a kind of a straightforward human rights analysis.
Star Stuff asks, do you think USAID contributes more to slow violence in the global south than it helps?
I think that you've seen in the work that humanitarianism is always a double-edged sword. You've seen how, if you accept my argument, that the most lethal bomb that were dropped onto Gaza were A4 papers with words and drawings. They have led to the destruction of they were the most important part in that destruction of condition of life, the displacement and concentration of people in particular areas. And that was done through humanitarian language. Also, the fact that humanitarian provisions were slightly more available, though in no way adequate, and in no way that humanitarian safe zone was. We documented dozens of attacks on it, and there was no conditions of life available there. It did act as a magnet in terms of population transfer. So we need to be very careful with humanitarianism because it's a double-edged sword. It doesn't mean that all humanitarian help or all application of international humanitarian law, that is the law of war, necessarily genocidal. It is just to see that in the past there have been multiple braidings, intersection between humanitarianism in practice and in discourse and genocidal policies and ethnic cleansing.
Thank you. And this one will be our final question, so we can end at 30 minutes after the hour. But can you relate your analysis of the destruction of deep soil in Gaza over the past 16 months to the burying of villages with forests by the JNF beginning directly after the Nakba? Both are forms of erasure?
Yeah, of course. I've shown you also in the Wadi Gaza basin how Israel is using plans in order to erase the villages of Bedouin Palestinians, so return would not be possible. So the settler colonial practice is not only about, expelling people and taking their land, it's a complete transformation of that land. First, as an act of erasure, so people would not have where to return to. And two, it is to create conditions, another very different type of conditions of life calculated to amplify productivity. Again, that is, when I made a reference to the Green Revolution, it's all based on conditions of life calculated to amplify, and there are conditions of life calculated to destroy. So the complete, sort of terraforming and transformation of the landscape is or can be part of a genocidal campaign. I think the question referred to those villages, Palestinian villages, occupied and the inhabitants expelled in 1948, on which pine forests are being planted. In fact, sickeningly, pine forests that are considered Holocaust memorials are being used as acts of erasure of Palestinian life in that area. But I think that is being tuned, just like how we began the lecture with the project David and I undertaken on Nebelivka, tuned to weak signals. You see a genocide undertaken, you see all this expulsion, sometimes looking at the earth, looking at different species of plant, looking at sprouting, looking at the biological process that happened in the depth of the earth, allow you to understand what the phantasmagoric image is actually hiding from you, what the melodramatic image is hiding from you. So I think the lesson from this is to be tuned also to other type of signal, to weak signals within that. The word Wadi Gaza, why is it returning? And it becomes a hinge to an historical geographical exploration of the origins of the genocide. And sometimes when we only look at the feed on social media and on the news, it's so surface, you're unable to. Sometimes, we're looking at social media extracted videos, and we're looking at the ground behind what the image is. If the image is a destroyed house, we're looking at, at the side we see a certain plant is growing, or we see a certain field is dying, or we see, sometimes you need to look at the margins of an image in order to extract the information that is allowing you a much deeper and more nuanced interpretation.
Thank you so much. And just also for folks who can't see the chat, James's comment that a tree plantation is not a forest, I think also is a good grounding for this.
How can we conserve all the wonderful
questions?
Make sure that that's available to you.
Yes, we will save the chat. We will save the questions.
Okay, wonderful.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Eyal. Really appreciate your work and your presentation despite the disruptions. Thank you everybody who showed up. Thank you so much, my colleagues, Sean and Heather. Thank you for the amazing interpreters without whose work we would have a very narrow view of the world, and for all the exchanges that makes possible. Thank you everyone so much. And we will have the video minus the disruptions, the recordings on the CIIS YouTube page soon. And thank you, and happy birthday, David. Thank you, everyone, so much. Thank you, Eyal.
Thank you, Eyal. Thank you,
See you in
Targol.
person. See you in person soon, hopefully.
I hope so. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.